Today you'll learn how to use variables and tokens to make macros in Clipboard Maestro. These save a ton of time. For example, I have one that opens any website that I have bookmarked in my browser. Another instantly translates any highlighted text. Finally, we can spell check any word and see a list of possible alternatives. None of these macros would be possible without variables and tokens. Now let's learn how to use them. Real quick, I know Clipboard Maestro can be complicated, so you can sign up for a free coaching call with me using the link at the top of the description, where I'll help you save hours every week by automating your workflows. So you've probably made at least a few macros by this point and want to unlock some more powerful features of Clipboard Maestro with variables. But what even are variables? Let me show you through an example. So I'm just going to call this variable example. And I'm going to add a simple hotkey trigger. And this can be just something random, which I'll use to test this macro. And now let me show you how to set a variable. So I'm going to use the action set variable to text. And it has two fields, the first of which is where we name the variable. So we can call this anything we want. The variable just has to start with a letter, but it can have numbers, it can have underscores, and it can have spaces. So something like this would be a valid variable name, but this is what I'll keep it at for now, example _1. And notice on the right side that there is a little V here. This means that this is a variable field, which I'll explain later. And then now down here, this is a text field. It has a little T on the right, and we can enter any text that we want here. So I'm going to say this is an example. And you can see down here, the action is previewing what the variable will be set to. So currently it's empty because we haven't run this macro yet. But once we do run it, this example1 variable will get set to this text here. And now to use the variable, I'm going to add a simple action of typing text, insert text by typing, and maybe I'll change this to insert text by pasting. And now we want to use this example1 variable from before. Now notice again, this is a text field. That will be important in a moment. But first, let me show you the wrong way to use this variable. So we could say my message is, and then I want to use whatever example1 gets set to. If I were to do this wrong, then I would just type example1 as is. Now, if I go to a Notes app and I trigger this macro, you can see it types out or it pastes in the message. My message is example1. But that's not what we want. We want it to paste in the text that's contained within this variable. So the correct way to do it is to type % and then variable and then another %. And now we type in the name of our variable itself with a closing % at the end. By the way, you can download all of the macros from this video down in the description. And now if I go back to my Notes app and I execute this macro, we can see it works correctly this time. It types my message is, and then it displays the text that was included or that we set this variable to from before. So this raises a first important point about variables. Whenever we want to refer to variables in a text field, so any field that has a little T on the right side, we need to use this full formatting where we say % variable %, and then we put the name of the variable between the final closing %. Whenever we want to refer to a variable within a variable field, so with a V on the right side, we don't use this extra formatting around it. We just refer to it by its plain name. So if I wanted to change what that variable included, I could set the exact same variable to a different type of text later. So I could say, this is another example. And notice how I'm setting the variable example _1 to this text. I'm not typing out the full % variable % format. This would be incorrect because this is a variable field. But now I'm going to just copy my message, copy the same action from before. And maybe in between here, I'll add a type a keystroke action to press enter. So right now this macro will just type my message is, this is an example, it'll press enter to make a new line, and then it'll type my messages. This is another example. So let's test that. I'm going to delete what we had before, and I'm going to activate the macro, and we can see it works as expected. So a variable is just a way of storing some plain text that we can use later, either in the same macro or in another macro. I'll show what it will look like to use it in another macro momentarily, but first I want to talk about a third type of field, the third and final type of fields in Clipboard Maestro, which is the calculation field. So to demonstrate this, I'm going to use the action set variable to calculation, and notice, like before, the variable name at the top is a variable field. It has the letter V there, but underneath this has a little C, which refers to calculation. So unlike the T, the text field from before, this is a different type of field that wants a mathematical expression. So if I first set example 1 to some number, I'm just going to enter something random, and then we use that variable again later. Maybe I want my new variable to be called example 2, and I want it to be 100 plus whatever I set my first variable to. So now this is 100 plus example 1. And in a calculation field, the one with a little c on the right, I have to refer to the variable by its plain name. So I don't type out variable percent and then the variable name fully. You can see it's red, which means it's incorrect. I have to use the plain name by itself. In this case, it's yellow, which means the result will be invalid. And that's because the example 1 variable currently contains textual data. So I haven't run this macro yet. It still contains the old data for the variable, which would not yield a valid calculation. But I'm just going to move this down for now, and I'm going to say my message is variable or example 2. So we would expect this result to be 4,321 plus 100, because we're setting example 2 to be whatever example 1 was plus 100. And now if I try this macro, it yields 4,421. So this worked correctly. However, if I set this to be something that is not a numerical value, then the macro would not work correctly. I ran it and nothing happened, and that's because this is an invalid calculation. So a calculation must contain numbers and variables that contain numeric values. I have an entire video coming out at some point about calculations and functions, so this is all that I'll explain about them in this video, but in my later video, I will go into much more depth on them. So this is one way to set a variable with the set a variable action, but there are other ways to set variables as well. So for example, one of these ways is to prompt for user input. And this is just a simple action, which when I run it, prompts the user to enter details for some variables. By default, there are no variables added, but we can add variables for the user to fill in here. So I could say here that I want the user to fill out some message. And now when I test this macro, it displays a little box that says message, and then the user can enter some details here and press OK. So right now this does nothing because there's no actions that come after it. But like before, we could use the variables that get set in this action to perform later actions afterwards. So it could do the insert text by typing again, and I will say my message is, and now I will refer to this variable by the proper name, the full expanded name, because it is a text field. I have a simple macro that just pastes in the clipboard surrounded by the appropriate characters, but you can also use the insert token action. So you can come up to variable and search for your variable at the top, or you could find it directly in this list. Finally, of course, you could also just type out the text manually yourself if you prefer. Then I can also add a title to this action, enter a message, and now if I come back to my Notes app and run the macro, it says enter a message, and my message will be hello. And then once I press OK, it types out the text with the variable that we filled in. Now, I mentioned before that variables can be accessed from other macros as well. So to demonstrate that, I'll make another macro and I'll call this example 2. And here I'm going to add a simple insert text by typing action, and I will paste in the message variable that I had before. And I might say your last message was, and then have that variable be typed out here. So if I add another trigger to this macro and I execute my example 2 macro, it says your last message was hello. So notice that we didn't set this variable to any value within this macro, but because we set it to a value before in our previous macro, this macro also has access to that value. Later in this video, I'll talk about variable scope, which just refers to how variables can be accessed by certain macros and how they're stored. But for now, you should just know that variables can be accessed by different macros. So they exist not just within the macro that they're set in, but they can be accessed by any other macro as well. One other point before we move on to talking about tokens is that the case, meaning whether a variable is uppercase or lowercase, does not matter. So I could refer to this variable down here as capital message, and that refers to the exact same thing as a variable that's fully lowercase. So the case does not matter, and I'll demonstrate that by activating this macro again, and I'll say enter a message. I'll say hi there, and it types that message out correctly. So that's just to show that you can call the variable with any combination of uppercase and lowercase letters as long as they are the same characters. All right, now let's talk about tokens. So tokens are basically just placeholders that get replaced with some text once the macro is run. So a very common example of this is the system clipboard. This is one of the most useful tokens, I would say, which replaces this text with whatever the user most recently copied whenever the macro is run. So to demonstrate this, I'll come back to my Notes app and I'll add some text. I'll say this is the text I copied most recently, and I'm going to highlight it and press Command C to copy. And now I'm going to run this macro. So I'm going to type out my hotkey trigger, and that inserts the text, my message is, and then it pastes what I most recently copied. So that was this text from above, which we refer to as the system clipboard. So this token here gets replaced with whatever I copied most recently. And this is an example of a very useful token within Clipboard Maestro. Now there are a ton of tokens within Clipboard Maestro. There's a whole list on the wiki page, which I'll link to in the description. But within this video, I'll only cover some of the most useful ones. So whenever we want to refer to a token, we use the name from the wiki page, and then we surround it by percentage signs like I did here. Now let's take a look at some more common token examples. So again, tokens essentially let you add textual information to any text field, any field that has the little T on the right side, and they get replaced with a certain value once the macro is run. So two more useful tokens are the front browser URL token and the front browser title token. So I'm going to write title. So these two tokens will return the title of the URL that we're currently on, title of the web page we're on, as well as the URL for that web page. So I'm going to change this to a display text in a window action, and now I'm going to go back to the browser and activate this macro. And you can see it displays the title of this web page, which is tokens, Clipboard Maestro wiki, and underneath it, it displays the URL of the web page. So an example of a useful macro we could make using these two tokens is to set the clipboard to a markdown link of the front browser window. So I'm going to use the set clipboard to text action. And here I'll just use these two variables. I'll say bracket front browser title, and then I'm going to in parentheses, add the other token, which is the front browser URL. And then I'm going to delete the action we had before. So now whenever I run this macro, it will take the front browser title, put it within open and close brackets, and then it will take the front browser URL and put them in between open and close parentheses. So I'm going to come to my browser, I'm going to press my hotkey trigger for this macro. And now if I go back to a Markdown Notes app, we can see that when I paste, it pastes in the front browser link in the proper Markdown format. And when I preview it, you can see it looks like this. And when I click it, it takes me to the appropriate link. Another token that can come in handy is the trigger value token. So that looks like this, trigger value, surrounded by open and close percent signs. And this token will return a value associated with how the macro was triggered. So if I use the display text action and I say display text in a window and I put the trigger value, then now when I run this macro, it will display the keyboard shortcut that I pressed to activate it. Now, even if I have multiple triggers on this macro, like a type string trigger, I'll type hello as my trigger. Then if I come to Notes app and use that trigger instead of the hotkey trigger, then it will display the text that I type in the window. So the trigger value token will return different values based on what type of trigger caused the macro to activate. And you can see what the trigger value will return based on the type of trigger on the Keyboard Maestro wiki page. But just to give one example of how you could use that is that you could have your macro do different things based on what characters the user types if they were activating the macro with a type string trigger. So if I say the case does not matter, meaning that hello all lowercase or hello all uppercase preceded by a semicolon would activate the macro, then I could have the macro do different things based on what exactly was triggered. So this is a good example where we can actually use variables and triggers together. So I could say I'm going to set a new variable and I'll just call it trigger value to the token of the trigger value. So what this does is it's going to create a new variable called trigger value and set it to whatever value caused the macro to activate. So whatever type string the user entered to activate this macro is now stored in this trigger value variable. And then I'll just use a simple if condition down here, and I'll use the variable condition and say if the variable trigger value, and then here I can select matches and say if it matches semicolon lowercase h, then I will insert text by typing and I'll say the first letter you typed was lowercase h. Otherwise, if it doesn't match that, meaning we typed an uppercase h at the beginning, then I will have it display that as well. And now if I come back to my Notes app and activate this macro with a lowercase h, it indicates that. Otherwise, if I use a capital H, then it will tell me that as well. So obviously this is a very trivial example, but it just illustrates the point that we can have the macro do dynamic actions based on what caused it to be triggered. So for example, you might be able to use something like this to perform different actions if your macro was activated from a cron job or a certain time of day trigger versus if it was triggered manually with a hotkey trigger. Okay, so I just deleted the actions and added back the hotkey trigger from before to show you a new token called the Finder Selection token. So I'm going to make a new action to set a new variable and I'll call it current file. And then I will set it to a token of Finder Selection. So what this token does is it returns the path of whatever file is currently selected within the Finder. So you can already see it being previewed here. And if I open up my Finder, you can see this file here, text.txt, is highlighted. And if I select a different file, we'll notice that that is updated within this variable as well. So the finder selection token just returns whatever file is currently selected. We could use this to perform different actions based on the type of file that is currently selected. So for example, using the switch case action, which is kind of like an if statement, but we can add multiple conditions. So I'll say if the variable current file contains the word text, then I will add an action to display text in a window, and I might say you're selecting a file that has text in the name. And then I might add another condition that says if the highlighted file contains the word files in it, then we'll do the same thing and change this to files. Now if I go back to Finder and activate this macro, it displays you're selecting a file that has files in the name. And if I go to the text file, it will do the same thing, it has text in the name. Now again, this is a pretty trivial example, but we could do things like checking the file extension of the currently selected file and using an action like open a file with a certain application based on what file type is selected. So I have a macro like this that will open it with a video editor application if it ends with a .mp4 or .mov. It will open it with a text editor if it ends with a .pdf, and so on. Now, you could just open your files normally by double-clicking on them, but what you could do to make another useful macro is to have this open them in a secondary application. So if I press this hotkey, instead of opening this in a text editor, the default text edit application, then I could open it in Sublime Text, for example. All right, let's take a look at a few more useful tokens. So one of these is the mail contents token. So that looks like this. Percent mail contents, and then a closing percent, and I'll say current mail. So what this token does is it returns the contents of the mail message that you currently have selected. So I have an email open here, and I'm going to just add one more action to display text. I'll say display text in a window and use the current mail variable. And now when I run this macro, it displays the text of the front email that I had selected. So again, the text content of this email that I had open gets put into a variable, which then displays in a window. So this hopefully is getting you in the mindset of how you can use variables and tokens together to then perform actions using those tokens for useful results. So I might want to filter the text of my email message, and I'll say variable current mail. Maybe I want it to all be set to uppercase, and then I can have that display in another window, which would look like this. And now when I run this macro, it will display the contents of that email completely uppercase. All right, we've covered some basic token examples, but let's look at a few more advanced examples. So I'm going to, again, have a couple actions to set a variable to text, and I'll call this example, and underneath I'll add a display text action in a window. And then I'll just have it display the results of my variable, and we can use this setup to explore a couple more tokens. So all of the tokens we've covered already, like the system clipboard or the trigger value token, have the name of the token in between two percent signs. However, some tokens also have what are called parameters. So you can think of parameters as additional settings that customize what the token outputs. Not all tokens have parameters. So for example, the system clipboard does not have any parameters, but one token that does have parameters is the past clipboard token. So that looks like this, past clipboard, and we surround it by %signs like usual. However, we add a final %sign at the end where we can insert some number in the middle. So in between these two %signs is the parameter that will customize what this token outputs. So the past clipboard token returns the past clipboard of whatever number you have here. So if I set this to past clipboard of 0, that would actually be the exact same thing as the normal system clipboard token. It's just referring to whatever is most recently copied. It's not a past clipboard at all, it's the current clipboard. But if I set this to a past clipboard of 1, that would refer to what I copied before what I copied most recently. And this would refer to 2 items back, 3 items back, and so on. So for demonstration's sake, I will put past clipboard 1, and underneath that, I will put past clipboard 2. So this will set the example to the thing that I copied most recently, followed by the thing I copied before that, and followed by whatever I copied before that. Now let's go back to my Notes app, and I'll say first item, second item, and third item. And then here I'm going to copy these from bottom to top. So I'm going to copy the third item, then I'll copy the second item, and then I'll copy the first item. And we can see in my clipboard history that first item is first, second is second, and third is third. And now if I run this macro, which will set the variable example to the first, second, and third clipboard items, so 1, 2, and 3, then we should expect it to display those in a window. And the macro runs correctly. It displays the first, second, and third most recently copied items to the clipboard. So again, this is an example of using tokens that have parameters that allow us to customize what the token will output. Another example of a token that has parameters is the window name token. So window name, and then I'll add another %sign because this has parameters. And what this token does is it returns the name of the front window if I set it to a parameter of 1, the name of the second window if I set it to 2, and so on. So if I open up my downloads folder in Finder, and then I make a new window set to my desktops folder, so I have desktop at the front and downloads behind, and then I run this macro, it will display the name of the foremost window title followed by the name of the secondmost window title. A similar token is the application token. So application 1 would return the foremost application, while application 2 would return the secondmost application. So Keyboard Maestro is at the front, Obsidian is behind, and you could use the parameters to specify how many applications back you want to see. Now, so far, all of the examples I've shown have had one parameter, but there are actually some tokens that have multiple parameters. So an example of this is the ICU date time tokens. So there are some tokens like the ICU date time plus that have 3 parameters. So I'll show what that looks like if I come paste this in. So the first parameter is the amount of time that you want to offset the current date by. So I'm going to offset the current date by a factor of 3 and then change the unit of time to days and output the date format. You'd have to check the ICU documentation for this, but I know that 4e's will output it in a day format. So currently I'm recording this on a Sunday, and if I run the macro 3 days from now is in fact a Wednesday. Now this is a pretty advanced token type. Most tokens will have either no or just one parameter, but it's important to realize that some tokens do have these more advanced customization options. So one final point is that variables are actually a special type of token that take one parameter. So variable is the type of token, and the parameter is the name of the variable that we're selecting. So I mentioned before that tokens can only exist within text fields. That's why we always refer to variables in this format whenever they're in a text field. It's because we're referring to them as a token and getting the specific variable through the parameter. All right, so now we've covered the basics of variables and tokens, but let me show you a problem with variables. So I'll make a new macro and I'll call it display file, and then I'll just add a hotkey trigger to it. And I'm gonna add a couple actions here. So the first one I'll add will be the prompt for file action, and this will prompt the user for a file, and I'm gonna have it prompt for a file from the downloads folder. So if I just try this action, it looks like this. It prompts this, and I can select a file, and it will save that file name to a variable. So I'll just call this file, and then I'm going to add another action to pause for a few seconds. I'll just say 5 seconds for now, and then I'll have it display text in a window, and I'm going to use the file variable and display the results of what the user selects. So when I run this macro, it's going to ask me or prompt me to select a file. So I'll just select the text file from before, and after 5 seconds, it will display that file in a new window. So this is pretty straightforward. It works as we expect it to. But what I'm going to do next is make another macro, and I'll call this open file, and I'll add a hotkey trigger to this as well, a different trigger, and I'll add some actions. So first I'll set a variable to text, and I'll call this the Finder selection token. So if you remember from before, the Finder selection token just returns whatever file I have selected in Finder. Okay, so then after this, I'm just going to add one more action to open a file, and I will use the file variable that we select above as the file that we will choose to open. And then maybe I will change the default application to be something else, like Sublime Text. So this is similar to the macro we made before, where when we activate the shortcut, it will open the currently selected file in a certain app that may not be the default. Okay, so I just added another file to my downloads folder. It's just a screenshot, a PNG file, and we still have our text file from before. But here's where problems can start to happen. So I'm going to come back to my first macro that we just made, and I'm going to run it, and it prompts me to select a file. So I'm going to select this file, and we'd expect it to display the path to the screenshot.png after 5 seconds in a window. But I'm going to run it, and while that is running, I'm going to go to my Finder and activate my other macro. So you can see my macro activated. It opens my text file in Sublime Text like it was supposed to, but the window that displays the path to the first file is incorrect. We expected it to display the screenshot file, but instead it displayed the text file. So I'll show that one more time. I'm gonna activate this macro, do the screenshot one, and then I'm gonna activate my other macro to open the text file. And after 5 seconds pass, the first macro displays the incorrect file name. Now this is because, like I mentioned before, variables are shared between different macros. So a macro that uses this file as a variable name is referring to the same variable as the variable that's referring to the file here. So what this means is that in the 5 seconds between where we set this variable to be the screenshot.png, the other macro is changing the value of that variable to our new Finder selection, which happened to be the text file. So this macro finishes running before the first macro gets to this point. But by the time it gets to this action, the file name has changed to what it was set to in the other macro. So it got set to the text.txt file instead of retaining the original screenshot.png value. So we ended up with unintended behavior because we originally wanted this macro to prompt for a file and then display the file we selected after 5 seconds, but we ended up with a file being displayed that was not the file that we selected. So this is just one example of how things can go wrong when variables are shared by all macros. Thankfully, however, there's a solution to this problem. There are actually 4 different types of variables within Clipboard Maestro. There are global variables, which have included all of the variables that I've shown so far in this video. But there are 3 other types: local, instance, and password variables. What distinguishes these different types of variables is their scope, which refers to how they can be accessed. So the scope of a variable just refers to where the data within that variable is stored and how it can be accessed. So let me explain more. So to help understand the different types of variables within Clipboard Maestro, consider an analogy of a classroom with a bunch of whiteboards on the walls. In this analogy, any of the students in the class can go up to any of the whiteboards and read what's on them. They can write or erase whatever they want on the whiteboards. All the whiteboards are shared by everyone in the classroom. So in this analogy, each of the students is like a macro, and each whiteboard is like a global variable. In the analogy, any student can read or write on any whiteboard. And similarly, in Clipboard Maestro, any macro can read or write to any global variable. You can access global variables, meaning that you can read or write to them from pretty much anywhere. You can access them from all macros within Clipboard Maestro, and even external scripts that are activated by Clipboard Maestro. So for example, you could run a Python script from Clipboard Maestro, and that script would be able to access all of your global variables. But that's a subject for another video, which I will make soon. So global variables are the default type of variable when you set a new variable, whether in an action like the set variable action or a prompt user for list or so on. They're permanently stored on your hard drive, so they will persist even if you log out of your computer or restart it. The only way to get rid of them is to explicitly delete them. Now you can delete global variables by setting them to the delete token. So this is another token in Clipboard Maestro. It's delete surrounded by %signs. And we can see that if I try this action, try action, that this variable is now empty because it was set to the delete token. Now, if you want to see or edit all of the global variables within Clipboard Maestro, then you can do so in the preferences window. So if I press the shortcut command comma, that will pull up the preferences window. And if you go from general to variables, then you can see the list of all variables within Clipboard Maestro. And here you can select any of them and delete them by pressing this icon down here, or you can change them directly. So I could set this to another number entirely if I wanted. Okay, let's talk about the next type of variables, which are local variables. So returning to the classroom analogy from before, imagine that each student has their own personal whiteboard that they keep on their desk. Only the student that sits at that desk is allowed to write on the whiteboard, and no other students are allowed to write on it or even see what's on it. So these personal whiteboards are like local variables. They are only accessible by a single macro. So the way that you set a local variable within Clipboard Maestro is by adding local to the beginning of the name. So again, variable case does not matter. So I could say local all caps or local all lowercase. Those would both refer to the same thing. As long as you have local at the beginning of the variable name, then this will be a local variable. So I'm going to use this like before. I'm going to set the new variable local example to the word hello, and then I'll display the local example variable in a window. And when I run this macro, it works exactly like it did before when we used a global variable, But at the end of the macro, this local example variable is now deleted. So you can see it's set to empty again, even though we used it within the macro. Returning to the problem that we had before, we can actually solve that problem by changing the variable types to be local variables instead of global variables. So I'm going to change all of the instances that we had file to local file instead of having it as a global variable. And notice how in both of the macros, I have the same variable name. So I have local file here and I have local file here. However, since these variables are local to this specific macro and this specific macro, they will not interfere with each other at all. So again, I'm going to run the first macro. I'm going to select the screenshot and then press OK. And then I'm going to activate the other macro to open the text file. And after 5 seconds, the window correctly displays the screenshot.png instead of being changed to the text file path. So this is a case where local variables prevent interference between different macros, since all of the data that's stored in them is accessible only by the macro that they are set in. Now, local variables also cannot be accessed by sub-macros. If I have an execute a macro action and I chose to execute another macro from within this macro, the macro that is selected here would not be able to access the local example variable from this macro unless I explicitly pass it in as a parameter. So if I added a parameter and added the local example variable to that parameter, then the macro that's executed here would be able to access it. But otherwise, it would not be able to access my local example variable. Okay, the third type of variables are called instance variables. They function almost exactly the same as local variables, except for one slight difference. So local variables are deleted when the macro finishes running, whereas instance variables are deleted when you have a chain of macros that finishes running. So let me show what that looks like by making a new macro, and I'll call this display text. And I'll add a simple display text action, and I'll say display text in a window. And here I'll enter the name of the variable that we had in this example. So I'll say variable local example, and I'll just put that in this display text macro. And then here what I'm going to do is just call that macro from this existing macro. So that would be under the variables and tokens, and it was the display text macro. And I will disable this action. So all this macro will do when I execute it is it will set a local variable to hello, and then it will execute the macro display text, which will try to display that variable. So since this is a local variable, when I run it, the window displays nothing because this local variable is deleted when this specific macro finishes running. However, if I change this to instance instead of local, and then I change my other variable to instance instead of local as well, then now when I execute this macro, it correctly displays the name of this variable. So instance variables are deleted after all of the macros that are called from a specific macro. So if I call this macro from the parent macro, then the instance variable will persist. It will not be deleted until the final macro in that chain of macros, which ends here, finishes running. So local and instance variables are almost exactly the same, except for when they are deleted. Local variables are deleted when the specific macro finishes running, whereas instance variables are deleted once all of the macros that are executed from it finish running. So now that we know about global, local, and instance variables, it's generally best practice to use local or instance variables in your macros unless you specifically need the contents of a global variable to be shared by multiple macros. One case where it's good to use global variables is where you want those variables to be shared by all of your macros. So An example of this might be a macro that uses a file path to a certain folder on your computer. So I have a file path to this folder here, and let's say I want this to be my Obsidian file path. So right now this is a global variable, and then let's say I had this macro do some more stuff down here, and then what if I duplicate this and then have a different macro, another macro that I also want to use my Obsidian file vault path. So I could say do even more stuff. Now, if I kept both of these as local variables, they would both be set to the Obsidian file vault path and then deleted at the end of the macro. So both of these macros would delete the local variable at the end. But as we can see here, this is duplicating some actions. So both of these actions are duplicated when I could just set one global variable to my Obsidian file vault path and use it in both places. So I could delete this action entirely, and if I ever needed to use that file path in this macro, then I could just refer to it and it would already be created from this other macro. So this has the added benefit that if I ever need to move my Obsidian folder or change the file path, I only have to update it in one place, in one macro. And that change would be propagated throughout all of my macros. So if I change it to something here and I run this macro, you can see that it updates the variable value. And if I were to try to use that variable in another macro, it would correctly display the updated path to the desktop. Now you could also set these global variables directly in the settings in the variables menu. So you could come here and change this to whatever you want. So you updated the name of your vault to something else, then that would update it in all of the macros as well. So when I run it again, it changes that global variable everywhere. So the last type of variable in Clipboard Maestro is the password variable. So to demonstrate password variables, I'm going to just make a new prompt user for input action, and I'll add a new variable here. And to make a password variable, all you have to do is start or end the name of the variable with PW. So this would make it a password variable. We could also say var name PW, or we begin or end the variable name with the word password. So this is now a password variable as well. And now I will run this macro, and you'll notice that when I type anything in this box, the characters are concealed. Password variables are available to all macros, so they're kind of like global variables in that sense, but they are not displayed in the preferences. So if I open preferences and scroll down, you'll see that password var name does not appear anywhere in this list. Password variables are only stored in memory. So if you restart Clipboard Maestro or restart your computer, they're completely erased. But we can use them as normal in Clipboard Maestro. So we would select the name of the variable and display it within the correct format. And now if I were to run this macro, I would type in something like new password. And when I press enter, that is displayed in a window. So password variables can be useful when you want to conceal what is typed into a text box and to ensure that they are deleted whenever Clipboard Maestro or your computer restarts. As a side note, whenever you have a prompt for user action and you have a variable that starts with the term local or instance, so I'll add one more and I'll call it instance new var, and I run this action, then the name of the local or instance is omitted from the prompt for user action. So this can be useful when you want to prompt the user for input, but you don't want weird names like local email to appear in your list. the type of the variable will be omitted unless it is a password variable. Now we'll discuss some advanced features when using variables specifically related to variable arrays. So an array is just a list with multiple items. So I'll call this variable local array, and within the text, I'll add some text that's separated by commas. This is an example. When I run this macro, this local variable will get set to this text, and if I were to display that text in a window like so, it would display normally. So when I run it, it displays the text like it normally does. However, you can think of a variable array as a single variable that contains one or more subvariables. So the subvariables within a variable array will be anything that's separated by commas by default. So if I were to type open and closing brackets and type 1, that would refer to the first item in this list. So when I run it, it will display the word this, which is in fact the first item separated by a comma in this list. And I could list all of the items in this array as well. So I could say 1, 2, 3, 4, and it would refer to each of the comma separated items in a separate subvariable within the array. So this formatting here, using opening and closing brackets, and then using a number to refer to the sub item within that list, is how you can access all of the components of that array. So again, everything before the first comma would be the local array value 1. Everything before the second comma and after the first comma would be the second item, and so on. You can also set custom delimiters, which refers to the value that the text would be split on. So if instead of commas, maybe I had a colon like this, and I replaced all the commas with colons, then I could still access the different items in the list just by using colon after the brackets to indicate that that is the delimiter that the text would be split on. So now when I run it, it displays it correctly because it's using the colon as the thing that separates the items of the list. And I could set any custom delimiter that I wanted. I could use letters like this, and that would separate it on the letter A. Anything can be used as a delimiter except the percent character. So the percent character could not be used as a delimiter because that refers to the end of this token here. One final point is that you can use calculations within these brackets. So if I had something like this and I added a delimiter of a colon, then this would refer to the third item in the list that's separated by a colon. So that would be the and, which appears here. And I can even have variables in this calculation. So if I had a variable that was set to a numeric value and it was called item, so maybe item could be set to a value of some number, then this would run correctly as well. All right, that concludes this video. If you enjoyed, be sure to subscribe for more cool content, and I'll see you next time.